one of my biggest pet peeves are directors that don't feel like they have any agency on their own boards. They're kind of sitting there, they're passive. And we hear, and we've heard several panels in the past talk about think like an activist or be your own activist and try to prepare for activism in advance. How do you guys think about that as a lead off to set the stage, not just for activism, but for the conversation? Jonathan, you want to start?
Sure. I think when the adage is think like an activist, you're really supposed to be thinking like a shareholder, like an investor. And I always make a difference between an investor and a trader, although they're all shareholders. And so I think one of the things that directors should regularly do is be asking the finance team and the CEO, what are you hearing from our shareholders? What questions are they asking? I love to listen to our quarterly earnings calls because I want to hear it firsthand, hear the tone. Who's new in the stock? Who's left the stock? Do we know why for each case? Because then I think you can get a sense of what the shareholders, who you and we as board members represent, are thinking. And so I think that's a great way to begin thinking like a shareholder.
Yeah, I agree with Jonathan. And the first part of your comment had to do with agency. And it's very difficult to get on a board. It's a very exclusive club. And people are worried about getting thrown out of the club. And that is why I think some directors find it very hard to find their voice, particularly on areas of disagreement. And that's where I think building the board culture becomes a big part of your defense, which is building mutual trust and respect. That's either led by the chairman, if it's a split CEO chairman, or the lead director, or if those people aren't doing it, if you're a seasoned director, take that role to try to build mutual trust and respect in the board so that people can find their voice in these situations.
When people join boards, there's a learning curve. And the directors that remain passive, frankly, don't ever get off that learning curve because they're so nervous. One of the things I would tell you is it is extremely important to do onboarding before you join the board. And when you onboard, you want to be talking not just to the CEO and the CFO, but investor relations is important, business unit heads, but do your homework. Learn about the company that you're going on the board of. And if you're already on the board, you want to make sure you're refreshing that experience at least on an annual basis. And one of the things I tell boards when there are people who are passive or not involved is try to get them involved and give them feedback if they're not participating in an active manner. And when you're new on a board, it takes a little bit of time to get your sea legs, but you shouldn't be silent, and you should use the times with your fellow directors to really learn from them and ask them what they see as the biggest or hardest issues that the company faces. And some people are very natural at doing that, and some people it takes some learning, but it's really important because if you want to follow the mantra of being your own activist, you better understand the company that you're on the board of. Because if you don't understand the company and the risks it faces, what are the opportunities that it has, it's very hard to challenge the management team and your fellow directors about, are we doing the right thing? Are we thinking outside the box? There's a lot of different roles that one can play when they look from an activist perspective. Do we have the right board? The governance issues? Do we have the right capital structure? Should we be looking at changing our portfolio at all? Should we be selling the company? All those questions are always on the table. They're never off the table. And so part of it is really making sure that you do your homework. One other thing for new directors that I think is really important because it gives them an active voice is go through the board materials with somebody from the management team so that you can ask questions about the business as you're going through those materials the first time. It makes a huge difference. It creates rapport, but it also gives you the opportunity to think about things in a different way. You're a new director, you don't know the business as well. You can ask some questions. And one of the things sometimes management teams are worried about doing that because they're concerned, is the relationship going to get too close, or the CEO wants to be the one who engages with every board member. The best boards, you don't worry about things like that because everybody's pulling in the same direction, and the tide raises all the boats at the same time. And so it's up to each of the directors around the table to make sure that they bring out the best in other directors. Some people are going to talk more, some people are going to talk less. But the one word you used, Lynn, that I really try to talk to people about on being a board is respect. You have to have respect for your fellow directors. If that respect is lost, if that credibility is lost, you're not going to be able to be an effective director. And I think that's very important. That allows dissenting voices to be raised around the table. It also allows people to challenge each other. And the important part of being a director is being able to listen. Not just, give your perspective, but listen and take it into account and say, well, have you looked at it this way? Or why are shareholders so concerned about that? Or, if somebody comes to us tomorrow and says we should be selling the company, what's the answer that we shouldn't be selling the company tomorrow? Things like that, if you think ahead, you won't be surprised. The one thing I tell CEOs when they're dealing with the boards is boards hate surprises. You can't undo a surprise. And one of the things that I remind people is, even if you think a strategy is not a smart strategy, if somebody on the street is pushing it, whether it's a research analyst, a shareholder, an investor, or somebody that's on a bulletin board, make sure you address the things that don't make sense as much as you do the things that do make sense, because that's a better way to look at the company and think about the company and frankly challenge yourselves and your management team to be the best. But if an activist comes in with a new thesis and you've never heard about it as a director before, it may be a very stupid idea even, but if the directors are surprised by it, you're already working off your back foot. And so I really urge people to try to think about some of those issues ahead of time and try to think about making sure your board is well prepared, but knows what the good and the bad is, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. Because the activist is only looking at it from a particular perspective. You as a director should have the overall perspective. And sometimes that means understanding what doesn't make sense as much as it does what does make sense.
So, Lynn, let me ask you, we were talking a second ago about actually getting the information from management. I think very often, we've all been in either executive or advising executives roles in addition to the board. The management team has a view of the company, and they're curating the information that the board's going to see very often that goes into the board packet. How do you get access to the information that you want to see?
I think in a nice way, you demand it. There's a great tendency for, I think, some management teams to put 800 or 1,000 pages in a board deck, and hopefully maybe even tire the directors out. I don't know what the strategy is there, but anyway, one of the areas of I've been on a lot of boards and I've seen a lot of decks. One of the areas that generally is not there unless I push it is valuation gaps to peers. And so understanding those valuation gaps and the sources of them, is it some of the parts? Is it a conglomerate discount? Is it you just have a lousy strategy? I mean, understanding why they're there and what it is you can do about them, and having that idea of value creation in front of you, both what has occurred over a period of time and what value the strategy that you're on now is creating. And is it creating value that's competitive with the peer group that you are being looked at? And if it's not, what are the actions that are being taken to close that gap? And can you communicate both the strategy clearly, succinctly, that a fifth grader would understand it, and that you can clearly articulate what you're doing about proactively to close those gaps?
One of the things I urge directors to do, whether they're seasoned directors or new directors, is challenge the management team on what's in the board package. People that are come on a board from another board often say, well, we used to look at this and this and this. Why aren't those in the board materials? But one of the biggest problems, and Lynn, you sort of talked about it with size, is that there's no natural limit for an iPad about how many pages of documents you can put on. There used to be a limitation. We were joking about it before. If the board book didn't fit in the FedEx box, it didn't go out. So one of the things I tell corporate secretaries or those that prepare materials is print out all the materials. Take a look. If it's too big a stack, and it's not just the board materials, it's committee materials too. If it's too big a stack and you're giving it to the directors even a week before the meeting, how are they going to go through it? One of the things that Lynn did when she sent out the materials for her board, she was CEO, was she had a very comprehensive cover note. And she explained what was new in the materials, what had been eliminated from the materials, and what the meeting was going to focus on so that the board members could come into the meeting prepared. When board members don't have time to read all the materials, or they don't know what's the most important materials that's going to be covered at the meeting, or they don't know what some of the issues are, you're not going to be as effective a board. And it's up to the board members, frankly, to challenge the management team or the group about, do we have too many pages in there? If you're a director at some point in time, you're going to be involved in a litigation, is my guess. Being able to understand and being able to answer questions as to what you focused on in a meeting that was 6 months or a year ago. And somebody says, well, there were 2,000 pages there. How did you have time to read it since you only got the package 2 days before? Or even in some other situations, Lynn was pointing this out, these board books actually came from virtual data rooms. It was a service that was used. One of the secrets of virtual data rooms is you can track who reads what, how much time they spent on it, things of that nature. We urge our clients to turn off that feature because the last thing you want is them singling out a director who never opened the board book before the board meeting or things like that. And, if you're a paper person, there's nothing wrong with you asking the board, the corporate secretary to send you a paper copy of the materials. You don't have to keep all that stuff in the files, but you can bring it to the meeting. You can be prepared to talk about it. Different directors learn in different ways. They're just like our kids. They don't all learn the same way. You should do what makes sense for each particular director.
Well, as far as materials, I just became the lead independent on one of the boards I'm on. And the very first question I asked of management as I was coming into this role is, what are you preparing for us, the board, that's just done out of habit, that's not useful to the business? And how do we get rid of that? And what are you not preparing, or what do you think we should be seeing that we're not seeing? And then I asked the directors the same question. What in this book is unnecessary? You don't want to have make work. You don't want to have make work for management or for the board. Make work includes reading and highlighting pages that aren't relevant. So, and then, how do you get access to data? I think you ask. One of the things I do is I'm reading the Journal or the New York Times and I see things, I think, gee, I wonder how this relates to our company. I'll shoot a note to the CEO and I'll say, found this article interesting. Here's a simple question. I'm not doing it for a board presentation. It's just because I always have a learning curve to climb, and I'm not going to wait till one of our quarterly meetings when I've forgotten about that article. I just shoot off and get an answer fairly quickly. I think the other thing you have to do is you can't be afraid of looking stupid, particularly when you're new. Every business has got a host of acronyms that if you're not in that business, they might as well be speaking a foreign language to you. And so I'm never shy to say, what does that mean? Because I know that 6 quarters from now, if I ask that question, and it's been used every quarter in the board meeting, then I will look like it. Then I will be an idiot. I won't just look like an idiot, I will be an idiot. So, I think just being curious and not being afraid to ask questions. And I noticed in David's first answer, when he was giving his answer and talking as if he was on a board, all he did was end sentences with a question mark. It was never with a period and certainly never with an exclamation point. I think boards are great, and maybe it's because he's a lawyer and a law school professor and he uses the Socratic method and all they ever do is ask questions to get people to learn. But it's a great way to steer, keeping the culture that Lynn has talked about is so important. Questions are less offensive than statements with a finger.
One of the first things I tell directors when they're thinking about becoming somebody who wants to become a director on a public company or they're a new director, sometimes people get in the habit of, well, I only have to worry about it the 4 or 5 or 6 board meetings a year. You're a director every day of the week, every hour of the day. And it's important that you remember that. It doesn't mean that you have to be, it has to be top of mind, but things like what was just said about reading the newspaper, reading research reports, don't just rely on the company to get you things. If you see something that's interesting or you have access to somebody that can send you research reports about the industry or otherwise, look at those because those will give you particular perspectives. And sometimes it makes sense to share them with your fellow directors. If you're always thinking about what's my role as a director and you realize that you're always on, you will be a better director. Because the most important things that happen in the company happen between the board meetings, not at the board meeting.
So I know we're still spending a lot of time about preparing for the activists to come. I think that we should actually do that in real life, so we're going to do it up here as well. One more question I want to hit with you guys is what are the vulnerabilities that companies, whether they're the mega cap or the large cap, the mid cap, the small cap, the micro cap company? It seems like all of the activist campaigns kind of run on the same themes, right? Oh, there might be an ESG overlay or something like that, but it's, I want M&A, I want a breakup, I want a combination, I want you to get rid of this business line, you're allocating your capital the wrong way. Look at all that cash, give it to me. It's kind of the same things over and over. Is a board supposed to go through all of those every year? Or how are they supposed to think through preparing for kind of the inevitable?
Well, what happens at large caps is that happens automatically. They get presentations from investment bankers, from other experts. The problem with medium and smaller cap companies is they don't have those same resources. They don't have that same access. So if you're a director, you may have, in some cases, more access or ability to bring information into the boardroom than the management team does. And you should use that, and you should try to challenge yourself. I can't tell you should look at, is it time to sell the company every year, every quarter? But it's something that should always be at the back of your mind. What if we get an approach? What are we going to say? Where are we going to get information from it? Are there investment bankers that understand our company that we can call and get advice? The last thing you might be doing is having somebody make a proposal for your company and you don't know who to call, or you haven't talked about valuation and things like that. That doesn't usually happen in larger companies. It does happen in smaller and mid-cap companies because they don't have those same resources. So investment bankers aren't shy, but they tend to target the bigger companies. They can make a lot of money working with small caps and mid-cap companies, but they often have to be approached by a director or by a member of management to get involved in the company. It doesn't have to cost you a lot of money to do that. You're asking people to invest time It's an important resource. If they understand your company and they've looked at your company, they will be much better able in a crisis or a problem or an opportunity to give you advice about the company. If they have to get up the learning curve before they're even, before they can even start giving advice, you're going to lose some valuable time.
So on that front, I mean, when you're at a smaller cap company, having an investment bank come and make a presentation once a year, some period, is really useful. What's the state of the market? What are you seeing in our space? I don't know any banker that won't return your call.
Any good banker.
Any good banker, right? And maybe you're small that the biggest ones won't. But boy, there's a lot of bankers that are really good that you can call and ask. And so I think that's important. And, Travis, to your question, there's kind of a menu of things that the activists choose from. And sometimes they choose everything on the menu.
Yep.
But you should be looking at those things all the time. One of the things on the menu is, do you have the right members on your board? You get a chance to look at that every year as you go through your proxy. And I think it's important to say, what refresh do we need? And we know we're all friends. We know we're all colleagues. We get along well, but no one should feel like, gee, if I got off this board, it would be bad for my life. Because then you're not being a good board member. Then you're protecting yourself, not your shareholders. And so I think all that menu, I don't know what the right cadence is, but there should be a natural cadence where you're looking at all of it depending on your size.
So now that we're in universal proxy, it seems like, well, it is the case that activists can target individual directors as opposed to just trying to go through, get a control slate or even a short slate that is primarily their folks. How do you go through that process of, I don't want to say culling the weak link directors, but I said it. So, identifying the vulnerabilities of the board and maybe having back pocket directors or other opportunities to protect you. Lynn?
Yeah, I think this is one of the hardest things to deal with. And the best practice is rarely followed, but, best practice would be that the chairman, if it's a combined CEO chairman, then the lead director lead a process every year of both the board evaluation, committee evaluation, and individual director evaluation. And that is done in a way in which allows for constructive feedback to directors about. I always like to say, what would we like to see you do more of? What would we like to see you do less of? What would we like you to continue, doing? Use a framework, use it on everybody, so you're not singling an individual out. And that if that's a healthy process, then that allows for follow-up discussion with directors that might be vulnerable. The other is having a succession plan, not only for the management, but you have to have a succession plan for directors. And that one, in my view, best practice would be actually to have term limits so that you have a natural trigger that helps you refresh your board. And if you do it right, you don't have everybody leaving at the same time, that you have a natural flow of a couple new directors with, a couple going off. Having said that, as a director and a NomGov chair, I would say the hardest thing is dealing with an underperforming director and how do you coach that director off the board. Now, interestingly enough, the vulnerability analysis, which looks at management and the board, can be your friend in this because there are certain things that they tend to go after. One is very long tenured directors. Now, in some cases, your long tenured directors are your best directors. Don't get me wrong, but that's not going to stop them from going after them. And the logic is, you've been on this board forever, and this company is still underperforming. So you must not be an effective director. Overboarding. Most companies are pretty good about making sure that you're following the rules on the public company, but you usually aren't reporting your private company boards. And sometimes your underperforming directors might be really heavy into private equity boards, portfolio, boards, and might have 16 or, whatever. That will be found out by the activists. I mean, they will know what you're doing. They also sometimes use private detectives to follow directors, and they will go after directors for bad behavior outside of the boardroom. If you know that you have some directors with bad behavior outside of the boardroom, that also becomes an area where it's delicate, but you can talk to them about, because that's probably something they don't want to become public. And so anyway, I'm sort of talking too much here, but
No, keep going. This is.
these are the areas that will get attacked. I guess the other attack area is, and this maybe is good that it's the woman is saying this, when there was such a push on diversity, I think there are certain cases where we put people on boards that maybe didn't have the experience. Great people, very smart, probably very good executives, but not at the same level, or maybe not, experience level, or experience with the industry level. And the activists will sometimes come after that. So, if you have a board that has almost nobody with industry experience, they'll start pecking at the people who are the furthest away from that experience. So if it's like an industrial company and the person's in consumer goods, that kind of thing. And I think having those conversations with directors who are likely to be targeted, particularly if they are people who are weaker on your board, those are the things that help them get over the edge of, maybe I shouldn't stand for re-election next time.
One of the things that I found helpful as a CEO, and as I began to refresh our board, was to go to the more newly appointed board members after they got their sea leg, and I'd say, tell me what you think about our board. You've been to 2 or 3 or 4 board meetings. What do you think about it? And, sometimes you're too in the weeds to see who's not participating enough, or candidly, who's participating too much and playing CEO for a day once a quarter. We know those kind of board members, particularly if you're a CEO, those kind of board members. But just getting the opinion of the new person, saying, that's a perspective I hadn't seen before, and act on that. And I've been asked that as a board member and seen action on that.
Lynn said a lot of very important things, but to unpack a little bit, and this is just as important for directors as is for the company itself, you have to be thoughtful about how you approach some of these processes. It is a terrible idea to give directors written reports about their performance, because those will come out. Maybe involve the general counsel's office or an outside lawyer so that it can be privileged if you're having bigger issues with your board. But, it only takes one email. You go back to the Sotheby's activist situation. The outgoing chair of the NomGov committee sent an email to the incoming chair of the NomGov committee listing the strengths and weaknesses of each director. When that director was called to the stand in the middle of a trial and was presented with that, it was pretty devastating. So, you have to be thoughtful about this. The other thing is, Director succession is not something you do once a year. It's an ongoing process. People have life events. There are things that are going to happen. People change jobs. That should be constantly evaluated. If you've got good corporate governance guidelines, most large cap companies do. Many mid and small cap companies don't. But there's no harm in looking at some of those. But they have things like if a director changes a job, they have to, tender their resignation so the board can actually think about, does this person have time to continue to be constructive? Is it time for a change? The other reason you're thinking about director succession is you never know what's going to be around the next corner. And if an activist proposes somebody and for your board or suggests somebody for your board, you always want to have somebody in your back pocket that you're thinking about that could come on the board in a pinch. Because, if you're going to do a settlement with an activist, sometimes the activist has somebody in mind. Many times they don't. They just want change. But if you're willing to engage in settlement discussions, if you have somebody that's good, that's coming in from the outside, that's actually going to be much better for the company than letting the activists go out and pick who they think should be added to your board. And if you don't have anybody waiting in the wings, you don't have that opportunity. The last thing I would sort of say about this and evaluations is it doesn't help anybody to sugarcoat it. Sometimes it's the CEO that has to have the discussion. Sometimes it's the lead independent director. Sometimes it's the investment banker that's a friend of somebody or an outside lawyer. You have to think about how's the best way to get your message across. And there is no right answer every single time. No two boards are alike. We all come up with these guidelines and checklists and everything else. You need to make sure that they fit your company and fit your board. If you have a charter for your nom-gov committee that says you're going to do these 22 things, and somebody doesn't keep track to make sure that every year you do those 22 things, somebody is going to, in a fight, say, well, you said you did all this stuff. We requested books and records. And looking at the agendas of the last 4 nom-gov meetings, you didn't do any of these things. Last but not least is minutes. I hate drafting minutes, but it's my job. And it's an important thing for directors too. You want minutes that are sufficiently detailed so that they cover the items that were discussed at the meeting. They should not be a transcript. Nobody should be pushing record on the Zoom to get a live transcript of the meeting so they can prepare minutes. You'd be surprised what some people do to make their lives easier. Because that's a recording, that's a document. That's something that if you get a litigation hold, you have to preserve. It's important that minutes be done relatively soon after a meeting. Maybe there are a lot of meetings going on because there's an important corporate event. You want to make sure those minutes tell the story appropriately. One of the things that often happens in minute drafting is there may be a tax discussion that took 2 minutes and an M&A discussion that took an hour, but the tax guy writes the section of the minutes about what he or she talked about, and it's 3 pages, and the M&A discussion is a paragraph. That's not helpful for that. But that can come from the directors. Too often directors are silent about that, or they don't pay enough attention to minutes until they need to. Those minutes have to be sufficiently detailed so that you can refer to them in a litigation or in a proxy fight or anything else so that you remember. If they're too skinny and they don't even reference board presentations that were made or things like that, then you're going to be fighting an uphill battle to convince people that, in fact, you did talk about these issues or you did cover this. And so, we're in a category now where for minutes, it always what used to be less is more. That's not the case today. You want sufficient information in those minutes. That doesn't mean they have to go on for pages and pages, but they should be sufficient to cover what was discussed at the meeting. Please don't let your minutes say, Director X asked this question, Director Y asked that question, because it makes it look like anybody that's not in the minutes didn't ask any questions. And, again, it's to summarize the conversation. If there were outside advisors that were in the meeting, tell the minutes, tell when they were in and when they weren't in. If you say that you've got an investment banker that sat through your entire meeting, but frankly, he was only there for the first 10 minutes, well, somebody's going to, a smart plaintiff's lawyers can argue that that discussion that you had with the board wasn't privileged if this investment banker was there the whole time. So these are little things, but one of the things you have to think about being as a director or general counsel or CEO is corporate hygiene. And these things are relatively low-hanging fruit, but especially in smaller mid-cap companies that don't have the resources, these things often fall by the wayside, and it's incumbent for the board members to raise some of these issues.
I am so glad that you followed up my comments with "don't put it in writing." Okay. Even experienced directors in the heat of the battle write things down that they shouldn't write down. And so reminding board members of expected behavior around who talks externally and who talks internally, what gets written down and what doesn't get written down. And now in the age of chat GBT, when to use it and when not, because every question you ask in that thing becomes discoverable. So that idea of the hygiene that David's talking about, it sounds simple and it sounds like, oh yeah, I've been on a board for 20 years, we know this. I can't tell you how many times people have tripped up on that. And so being really, really disciplined about keeping the disagreements, keeping the evaluations, keeping things verbal and civil.
The other thing I would tell you, and this is important in any boardroom, is making sure that during board meetings, people are focused on the board meeting. Some smart plaintiffs' lawyers have actually subpoenaed somebody's text messages to find out, they were having a conversation with their child about their grade during the board meeting. Or they sent 250 emails during the board meeting having nothing to do with the company. Or they are constantly, you got a very busy director who spends half the time outside the room working very hard, but there's a crisis in his or her company and they have to deal with it. You can be the smartest director in the world. If you're not in the room working when the board is meeting and working, you're hurting yourself as well as your fellow directors.
So let's say an activist comes, right? So they are the ones who knock and they want to talk to all the directors on the board. They don't just want to talk to the CEO anymore. Now they want to talk to not just the chair or the lead independent. They want to walk through and talk to all of the directors. Should all of the directors that sit on a board be ready to speak with an activist? Should they be ready to speak with ISS or with the institutional investors? Whose job is it?
The answer is, should everyone speak? No. I mean, everything's going to be a unique situation, but the general answer there is no. The board should speak with a unified voice. There should be one person that's designated. That could be the CEO, it could be the chair, it could be the lead. And I think the speaking with is probably initially more a listening to and being very thoughtful. Hearing what's being said, not initially committing to do any of that the activist is suggesting, but learning. More information is better. And, will there be a time for some of the directors to talk to ISS? Yeah, probably, or perhaps. But that activist knocks at the door. I think your job is to learn and not to respond quickly. Have a response ready, because sometimes if it goes public, then you're probably going to need to have a company response. But activists frequently are counting on dividing and conquering the board. And so when you have, and they'll do sometimes very personal attacks on board members, that the risk is you have a board member with thin skin who says, I just need to call that activist and set them straight. I'm not not who they say I am. Well, as soon as that call comes, the activist knows where there's a chink in in the dam. And so you just have to, so I think the short answer is no.
Divide and conquer is important, but from an activist perspective, the first thing they try and do is divide the management from the board. And that's why the management and the board really need to be joined at the hip. It doesn't mean that the board has to agree with everything management is saying or doing, but the time for those discussions is in the boardroom, not publicly, being prepared so that, the directors know that if they get a call or an approach from somebody, it gets fed back to the CEO or the chair so that the company can take the appropriate action. Oftentimes, the first sense you have as an activist out there is that you get some strange research report or some strange question to a director that they heard from somebody they haven't heard from in 20 years, all about asking about the company or how's the company doing on this or that. Those are all things that are very important to make sure that they get raised to the right people. And again, in the best prepared companies, there are teams that are ready to deal with this. In smaller companies, you may not have that. The CFO may also be the chief administrative officer and general counsel all in one. So they're wearing different hats. But, you need to use some of those resources and know who you're going to call. The other thing is that you've got to be very careful because every time an activist makes an approach, the world is looking, and the activist knows that if they publicize that the company refused to meet, or the company didn't return the call, or I tried to ask a question on 5 conference calls, and they wouldn't let me ask the question. You're starting with your foot, in the quicksand when things like that happen. You will get penalized by the shareholders if you don't engage. Again, it doesn't mean you have full engagement. There may be times where the delay matters. You do allow an activist to address the board, or you have several meetings with directors and the activists in order to put your story forward. But you have to look at what's going to make sense in your particular situation. And I think too often people think that there's a playbook for activism. There is no playbook for the activist defense. It's a playbook for the activist. But one of the things you have to realize is activists are not treated the same way as the management team. Activists will throw 20 things up against the wall to see what sticks. If management changes its strategy in response to an activist, then management probably doesn't look all that good because management doesn't get the buy from somebody about looking at different strategies or changing the company's focus. And so you have to be prepared for that you're going to be fighting a different war. But the other thing to recognize is these things often go on all year long. It used to be they just happened around the annual meeting. Nowadays, proxies, come and go. Annual meeting, people think that they've got a vacation. An activist may show up in your stock a week after the annual meeting because something that got said or something that was in the newspaper or something else. It's not limited to any particular time of year. You always have to be on your guard. And the way to try to deal with some of these things is to be thinking ahead of time. What happens if we get approached? Who do we call? Who do we think about? How are we going to get the board together? Do I have the ability to call a board meeting quickly if I need to? That's not just for an activist situation. That's for crisis management. If a plant blows up or a truck, a company truck careens into a school or something like that, you need to be able to get the board together quickly. So you need to know how to reach your board members and be thoughtful about that. You don't want to overuse it, but if you can't get people together quickly in a crisis, it's going to take the company longer to respond and the board's not going to be seen as doing its job.
Are you going to need to form a special committee every time an activist comes up, or what should it look like?
Again, it depends on the particular situation. I am not a big fan of having lots of special committees. There's a time and a place for special committees, but one of the things that happens when you form a committee is you're balkanizing the board. You're splitting it up into factions, those that are dealing with this and those that aren't. And in some situations that's necessary. If it's a conflict transaction or something like that, that you have to play that game. But having people that are sort of more in the know can often generate resentment from those people that are not. And it's important to make sure that you involve all of your board members in these types of situations. If there's some people that don't have the same amount of time and you want to have certain directors that are going to maybe be meeting with the activist, that's fine, but make sure the board is kept informed, because if you have any director that thinks that they're on the outside, the activist is going to figure that out relatively quickly.
What? Go ahead and answer, but I'd like to hear in terms of this balkanization. What if you agree with the activists, at least on one point or another? Like maybe we should get rid of that director, or maybe we should get rid of that business line. But what do you do if there is starting to be those types of divisions among the board?
I'll go there instead.
Sure.
First of all, if the board is doing its job, there should be very few things that the activists would bring up that you aren't already discussing or aware of, and you may well have a few directors who don't agree with the activists and have what I call the automatic just say no, kind of response. But in general, one, you should always avoid the just say no response and engage, and you should do it by starting with listening as opposed to talking. But generally, the things that are going to be brought up, and particularly around strategy, portfolio, and value gaps, should be things you already know. And then sometimes what the difference is not so much that you disagree with what they're saying is the underlying problem, but what is the time frame and the mechanism for dealing with it? And to the extent that with the activists, you can point out, I always like Venn diagrams, so there's stuff over here that you think, the stuff they think. Well, where's the overlap in those circles, and how can you use that overlap to basically put forward that it's not so much we disagree with you, but it's all about timing and how. And to avoid Reg FD issues and so forth, you can go through the NDAs and all that. But generally, one of the things that they'll ask for is an investor conference. Well, actually, I'm a big proponent of going ahead and agreeing with that, because that gives you the opportunity to tell all your shareholders what it is that you're doing, what the timetable is, what the what the mechanism is. And again, you have to be thoughtful about how much you share and so forth. But it puts the heat down, I think, in the moment. The other thing about preparation is we talk about engagement, and this goes to what I was going to say before, was you don't use the activist showing up as the time to start engaging with your shareholders, and the time to start engaging with your the people that you're bringing in, your experts, your help. You should already have a relationship with a really good law firm that does this. You already should have a relationship with financial advisors. You already should have a relationship with PR firm. And so that's part of it. But more important than even all of that is you already should have a program for engaging with shareholders. And then the whole notion of continuing that engagement and then continuing of telling your story when the activist comes is important. And the only thing I would say about engagement with directors, and in one of the cases I was involved in, the ask actually from the activist, and he's one of the more nice guy activists, was basically, I don't want to meet with the CEO because I think he's the problem. Okay. And what we chose to do, rightfully or wrongfully, is we got the whole board together. The board as a total decided that there were three of us that were more experienced in these things and more experienced also in talking with shareholders and others, and that the three of us would go and meet with this activist. And we told the CEO, that we were meeting. We didn't but do it behind his back. And we said, likely he is asking for us to meet because he is going to bring you up. And I think there it becomes really important for the board to let that CEO know that the board is behind them, and the board is supporting them, but the board has a fiduciary responsibility to listen to this. And then what we did after we did all that, we did convince this particular activist to sign an NDA, convince them to do a standstill, and convince them that we had a plan that dealt mostly with what they were talking about, and they never made it public. Okay, and it played out, and at the end they made a ton of money, and they were really happy. But we did. The three of us went back to the full board and gave a complete debrief on the conversation with the CEO sitting there. That this was the conversation that we had, and this is how we handled it, and this is where they agreed. Next steps. And like I said, that one worked out really well and never became public. And the company was already on the path of doing what the guy wanted, and we ended up being fine.
On factions, I think you get two people in a room, they'll disagree over something. I mean, that's just human nature. But I think that's where this history of board collegiality, history of board culture has to come in, that you can disagree without being disagreeable. And I also think it's important that people feel like they're in the know all the time. And that becomes extra important when you feel like you're in a battle with an activist. The other thing I would just note with activists, and Lynn talked about being, having this knee-jerk reaction, my term, not hers, to always want to say no. I think it's important to try and really put that down if that's who you are. I keep on my desk a reflex hammer, one of the kind that the doctors use to tap your knee to see if your reflexes are working. And I keep it right there. One, it's a nice fidget tool to keep my hands busy during long meetings. But the other reason is because I know that my proclivity, when I hear something new, is to go, that's a stupid idea. So I hold that hammer and I say, I'm going to sleep on this overnight. And I cannot tell you how many times that it's a stupid idea became something that the next day or the next week or a month from now, that's the best idea we've ever executed on. And so I really think that when an activist comes, there's this initial reaction that you're in an adversarial position. It's just it's how we view them. So we have this meeting today, right? And we're talking about, but some of their ideas, after you get past the knee-jerk, no, that's a stupid idea, are actually worth thinking about. And as Lynn said, sometimes their ideas, hopefully most of the time their ideas are things that we've thought about, but the timing's not right, or we've thought about it and we know for more information, and we can, in that discussion, there'll be a time to share and get there. But I really think learning what the activist is thinking and being thoughtful about it. I think the title of this panel is Activists and Dissent. So sometimes it's not really dissent, it's a new way of looking at things to do things better. Boards have that duty to think about that all the time.
So we're running low on time, so I'm going to kind of ask you guys to frame up maybe that idea for us. And I'll pose the question as, when do you fight and when do you settle? Right? Like when do you take it all the way? When do you settle out? When do you, just try to get them to sign an NDA so you can tell them the truth, what's really going on, and they can understand. And of course they'll agree with you, right? How is it that you guys go and think through that particular dynamic? Because look, there are so many activists now. It's not like it was 20 years ago, definitely, even 10 years ago. There are so many people out there that are professional. They're running multiple campaigns a year. There are brand new activists that are coming out, trying to make a name for themselves, where if you even try to agree with them, they don't care. They have to go and make a name for themselves. So they're going to make a big fuss about things. And you might not know whether or not they are. And David, I'll start with you, but how do you decide whether to fight and go all the way or settle it out?
Again, it's not something that you want to have a rule of thumb for any particular situation. Each company can be different. It's important to understand what the activist is saying and seems to want. If you can keep it private, you're better off keeping it private, but don't be afraid that you lose control if it goes public. There are steps that you can take, and you should assume that it's going to become public. It is, by definition, usually you have to give up less if you can deal with it privately than publicly. Once the activist is out there publicly, they're going to want to make sure that they fulfill whatever they say. And some of the toughest activists are what I would call either the ankle biters or the newbies that have to prove themselves. And so they need a scalp on the wall. And you have to think about what that means and whether it's worth it for you in a particular company to fight it. I want to just break down two very important things that Lynn and Jonathan said. One is, don't wait for an activist to show up before you start engaging with your shareholders. It doesn't mean that you go and you try and meet with every one of your investors and have 3 board members and all that. First of all, the company has to be engaging. And secondly, in the right situation, the directors need to be available to engage. Vanguard, BlackRock, Fidelity, they don't have enough people to meet with every company. But knowing that you're willing to meet with them, even if they don't, is a very important thing from that perspective. The other thing in these activist situations where you're really faced in trying to decide which direction you go in is, I like your reflex hammer. I have a different way, two different ways to think about it that I think resonate with people. You don't want to react. You want to respond. Those are two different things. When you react, it tends to be rougher. It tends to be more emotional. When you respond, you tend to be more thoughtful. You know what you're trying to achieve. The other way to think about this is, it may sound really good, or you may feel really good if you can punch that activist in the nose. That usually doesn't work very well. And it's almost, if it feels too good, don't do it. Now, there's a lot of things in life where that's really true. Activism is no different. You have to be thoughtful, and that goes back to the respond and react. I think that knowing what your relationship is with your shareholders is extremely important in thinking through whether it's worth settling or not settling. And if you haven't spent the time to know what your shareholders are concerned about or think about, then it's going to be much more difficult to make that evaluation about whether it's the right time to settle and the wrong time to sell. You also have to think about if you have Vanguard with 15% of your stock, and you have somebody that's making a lot of noise and they're 0.5% of your stock, how's Vanguard going to think if you put somebody on your board from that entity? Oh yeah, we got rid of the activist situation. They're going to be mad at the management team because they're going to say you're letting the activist drive strategy or do other things. But having that relationship and having that ability, and good activists tend to talk to large shareholders themselves. You always want to be out ahead of that. And if you're engaging with your largest shareholders, you will be ahead of it. And sometimes that will be your early warning sign. I can't tell you how many of my clients have heard, because of an analyst or a shareholder says, so-and-so visited me and asked me a bunch of questions. They don't have to tell you, but if they have a relationship with you, they often will tell you. And you can get way ahead of the curve. Again, what you want to do is avoid the surprises. And one of the ways to avoid the surprises is know what your shareholders are thinking. You talked about this right up front about materials for the board, the investor presentations, and the questions that get asked. I actually suggest to people that they, at least on a quarterly basis, have the investor deck in the board materials, but also the reactions from shareholders. What are the shareholders asking for? You don't have to hear from the IR person at every meeting, but you should know what questions or issues they're facing, because those tend to come back to bite you.
Real quick, every situation is different. But if you're going to go, go to the mat, can you win? What is the assessment of can you win? Because if you can't win, then that doesn't make a lot of sense. And I guess the other is just if you're the kind of company that has a big target on your back, like an ExxonMobil, you might have to go and fight it just so that if you settle, then that invites thousands of people, to come in and try to get a settlement. So it's very situational, I think, company to company, but those are two things to consider.
Winning is not 52 to 48.
Yeah.
If 48% of your shareholders are upset with you, you should be figuring out how to avoid that vote, because that's not a win 52 to 48.
Yeah, and right, I think one, defining win, and a lot of times defining win is getting some agreement before it goes public that you can live with. But if it's going to get nasty and you think you can win in that defined term, which is more than 52, and I'll say this because I'm not a law firm stumping for business, sometimes the best thing you can do is fight. Like with slip and fall suits or wrongful terminations, sometimes spending and defending to win so that you don't get an onslaught, so that the guys who have billboards by the freeway aren't suing you every other week. The activist world has changed. There's more now. The proverbial ankle biters fighting, spend and defend and winning will send a message to them too. I think that's important to know.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind giving a round of applause to our panelists.